So welcome everybody. I'm grateful to be here to talk a little bit about the ethics and politics of burnout, and want to begin with this land acknowledgement. So I invite you to take a moment, if you have a window, perhaps look outside. Also take a moment not only to take a deep breath, connect to the land that you are in, but reflect upon the specific land and location where you are in. And please use the chat feature to introduce yourself, stating the traditional name of where you are joining us from. If you're not familiar with the original Indigenous names for the territory you are in, please Google and take this as an opportunity to join with me in this land acknowledgement. And I acknowledge that I am in Mi'kma'ki. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. Their inherent rights to this land were recognized in the Peace and Friendship Treaties, which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy peoples signed with the British Crown from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between multiple nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers joins our members and our communities in the necessary labor of reconciliation. We are grateful to live and work together as treaty people in Mi'kma'ki. Without action, acknowledgements are empty. Whether you are with us in Mi'kma'ki or joining us from elsewhere, please consider whose territory you are in, your relationship with that land, and your relationships with the Indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live in that place. We invite you to reflect on how each of us, as individuals and as a collective body of social workers, can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. Walaluyu. Thank you all. So today, I'm talking about burnout, but there are, of course, other terms as well: compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. And when I'm talking about this, which is a topic that has been of great interest to me, it is actually the topic of my doctoral research, and I'm grateful to be sharing a little bit about it here with you today. But whatever the term, whether it's burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and we'll talk about all of those terms, we know the feeling. We've all been there at one point or another, or witnessed a colleague or coworker, or family member, or friend. And we know the feeling of just being so completely empty, just completely wiped out. So when talking about our terms, different words have different powers and are connected to different research. They're measured differently, they're perceived differently, and there are different methods that have been developed based on different terms. So for that reason, I do want to take a few moments to talk about them. I also want to acknowledge the literature review. There's some literature, it is worth noting that there are limitations because they do tend to come from white settler European origins. So there's not yet enough research looking at intersectionality and minority stress, although I do want to talk a little bit about that today. But when we think about burnout, of course, we are going to think of social workers, healthcare professions. I was really interested that even cruise ship employees sometimes are at risk of burnout and compassion fatigue, which was surprising to me when I first started studying this, because you would think, oh my gosh, a cruise ship, like what an amazing dream job, right? But if you think about it, people are working 24/7. They are away from their family, their homes, their communities, and they are always on. And they are attaching to people who the guests, for example, who as soon as they start to attach and get to know people's names, they leave, and then there's a whole new group of people. So there's a lot of quick attachment and a lot of loss and letting go, which can be cumulative. And as it turns out, cruise ship employees do actually have a particularly stressful job that does often lead to burnout. Of course, it's well documented in allied health professions. It has become much more of an issue, certainly since COVID, but a little bit before. Healthcare professions, especially in the States, Joint Commission that accredits all hospitals, started talking about second victim. And the term second victim was seen as a more neutral term to compassion fatigue, in part because it doesn't have some of the associations and stigma of compassion fatigue, which we will talk a little bit about. Second victim speaks about, like, if there's an adverse event in the hospital, the patient obviously would be the first victim, but the healthcare providers that are somehow involved are the second victim, recognizing that it's the system that failed the patient and the people involved in the care. But that can also contribute to burnout if the system is failing. So for example, if there weren't enough checks on the medical process, and that component of recognizing that the people who are harmed in the provision of care are not just the patients or the ones experiencing that care, but also the providers who are failed by a system that does not ensure everyone's safety, both provider and patient. So I have tended to focus on vicarious trauma because it does have less stigma. It speaks to the same psychological, physical symptoms of constantly being exposed to traumatic experiences secondhand, right? So it can happen either through witnessing work, but it can also happen through listening or experiencing other people's accounts of trauma. And it can lead to profound personal beliefs as a result. So some symptoms, these are probably all some that you may relate to: having a hard time controlling emotions, feeling numb or disengaged, excessive fatigue or inability to sleep, being distracted easily, worrying excessively, destructive behaviors, lack of boundaries, avoiding, not feeling like you're good at your job, avoiding places or situations that remind you of your clients. So for example, if you work in a hospital and you see a lot of car accidents, you might avoid driving on the highway. So that would be a sign of vicarious trauma. Being jumpy to loud noises, thinking about your clients when you're off. These are all considered to be symptoms of vicarious trauma. Compassion fatigue is the more generic term, and one of the oldest terms, and it is very similar, certainly. It has been, however, stigmatized because of the word compassion, and compassion is considered to be, by many of the scientists or the people who look at numbers, to be maybe a soft emotion, and that's one of the reasons why strategically there's been a shift to second victim. But the symptoms are very similar in terms of all of the different components: feeling overwhelmed, helpless, extreme fatigue, reduced empathy, struggling to concentrate, conflict, feeling physically sick, feeling overwhelmed, reduced productivity. And it is, some suggest, potentially a little more chronic. And then burnout is the most chronic component of it. So it really is more on that numbness, apathy, memory lapses. And there are many possible causes for it, which we will talk about, but obviously feeling stress, vicarious trauma, feeling overwhelmed, but also like feeling unable to meet work demands, maybe neoliberal managerial policies that lead to impossible work demands, and potentially also moral distress due to systemic injustice that is part of what's causing all of this. More symptoms. It can obviously lead to not only isolation from peers and coworkers, but missing work. And that, so it kind of becomes a self-defeating problem. So the system might cause it, but it still is also reaping the consequences of it. And we can also see that obviously if we're having memory lapses, easily distracted, it can also impact our clients as well as ourselves. So lots of different terms. Compassion fatigue was the earliest, and there are others. For my presentation today, I am going to be using them interchangeably. And my general theory around this is whatever we call it, we all know the feeling. We've all had those thoughts at one point or another. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important for us to discuss. And unfortunately, society's expectations have tended to be just learn to handle it. And we often internalize, this is just part of adulting. This is just part of the way it is. And we sometimes blame ourselves. Why can't I get my act together? And so disorganized. And some of that negative self-talk that we might have towards ourselves can intensify our experiences. Now, why does society have these expectations? I would suggest that there is a role of gender in social work burnout. We know that social workers are disproportionately female, and that is abundantly true. And that not only means that we might be experiencing some gender misogyny or other issues, but we're dealing with some of society's expectations around gender and role, which makes it harder to balance work and life. And then, of course, salaries. So unfortunately, there continues to be a wage gap between social workers based on gender. So we know that that is one issue that can contribute because, of course, if we're struggling financially, we might need to take a second job. We may not be able to pay for somebody to help us with something. So it has a lot of ripple effects. And if that is true for gender, how much more true is that when it comes to other forms of oppression? So when we think of intersectionality and the ways in which there's a multiple cumulative complex interaction between all the different types of forms of discrimination and the ways in which, for example, somebody who is identifying as a person of color might be experiencing microaggressions, perhaps from their coworkers or their boss, perhaps from the clients or patients or people that they're working with. And that can intensify what is already a very traumatic experience. So I am suggesting that we have an ethical mandate to discuss burnout as social workers and to consider all of the different factors that are implicated in the experience of burnout. And there are multiple ethical implications of burnout, and it is a reciprocal relationship. So on the one hand, when we burn out, of course, we're failing ourselves, our loved ones, our clients or patients, our employers, and the common good. But we also, by burning out, are letting the bad system win. And this is not meant in a judgmental way at all, but it is meant in an acknowledgement of the ways in which perhaps some of our burnout is by design. And when we don't address the symptoms, right, we as social workers who might be experiencing burnout have difficulty doing our basic tasks because that's how trauma and burnout happens. But it also means that it's harder for us to focus on things in addition to our work, like, for example, trying to advocate for change. This is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to remember Audre Lorde's quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." And so it's truly important for us to be thinking about self-care and vicarious trauma, because if we can recognize the consequences and toll and potentially even try to translate into numbers the ways in which the system is potentially losing employees, is having negative consequences, but also the ways in which we ourselves are suffering, but recognizing that there is a potential design component to it, because we as social workers are often working with stigmatized populations. So we inherit an associated stigma. So when we are working with some populations that are historically and disproportionately discriminated against, perhaps they're people with disabilities, perhaps they're people struggling with poverty, perhaps they're part of an oppressed minority group, then we inherit some of their associated stigma. And that is potentially one of the reasons why we are underpaid as a profession. And that is also one of the reasons why it's harder for us to fight. And maybe there is that component because there's a divide and conquer strategy where we are not able to necessarily work together with those oppressed groups to align. And that's one of the reasons why our social justice work is so important. So my suggestion is that burnout is actually a wake-up call for each of us on a personal level, but also on a political level, that we need to be working together to organize ourselves so that we can be united in trying to show the systemic causes for why we are all overwhelmed with difficult workloads, with impossible to meet standards at work, with productivity standards. There is a component to our experiences that has a political implication. So that is one of the many reasons why we have an ethical mandate to discuss burnout as social workers. Now, since today's session counts as regular professional development, but it also can count towards your ethical training requirements, as well as your vicarious trauma mandatory professional development requirements. So it can be used as either. I do want to kind of go into greater depth around our ethical mandate, recognizing that our soon to be new ethical code that is being developed by the CSW is only going to emphasize what I am already discussing. But when we think about this in general, how does our ethical mandate to show respect for the inherent dignity and worth of persons translate into how we treat ourselves? How do we inspire hope when we feel hopeless? And that is, I think, one of the fundamental challenges that we all face. And so that first value of respect for the inherent dignity and worth of persons, and recognizing that we have a responsibility to uphold human rights, extends to ourselves as well as our clients. And it certainly also impacts the work that we do with our clients, because if we are too overwhelmed and burnt out, we, by self-preservation, are designed that we will cut corners and provide maybe less good services than we would if we were able to think clearly. So there's certainly that ethical mandate, but there is also the deeper mandate, which is the pursuit of social justice. And in what ways are our social justice values that is speaking to our need to work to transform the systems we live in and work in into those that are more equitable? To what extent is that hampered by our experience of burnout? So it is, of course, hard to advocate effectively for others if we're not advocating for ourselves. And I find this helpful for us to remember, because many of us are brought up, perhaps because of gender, perhaps because of a variety of other factors, believing that taking care of ourselves is selfish. However, we have to recognize that the more we are able to advocate for ourselves, the more our voice will be taken seriously to advocate for others. And we have to be reflecting on that intersection of how burnout is speaking to that neoliberal approach to the provision of care that sees each of us as cogs in a system easily replaced. Of course, we are seeing that increasingly the system is starting to realize that there are only so many cogs in the world, and they are needing to rethink their strategies. So I believe that this is a super pivotal time where we can align and work together with other professions, specifically around the area of burnout. And this is something that we've been talking about. The vicarious trauma working group of our professional standards committee has been talking about having an interdisciplinary conference specifically on the topic of burnout, because that can be a way for us to align with other allied healthcare professions to demand a change, because the current model is set up to fail everybody, and that, except maybe the pharmaceutical industry. So that is something that hopefully, if you're interested, please reach out to me afterwards. I'm always eager to have more people working on projects with me. Of course, our third value, ethical value, is service to humanity. And we see here, even in our code, which I'm looking forward to it being, edited or rephrased, we see the word social workers place the needs of others above self-interest when acting in a professional capacity. And of course, we know that's true. However, it is also not true, right? So it's not like I'm doing therapy with someone and they are coming to me for grief counseling and I say, you think you have it bad? Let me tell you about me. I have it bad. No, we're not talking about that. However, we do need to not be burning ourselves out, because the care of ourselves is part of caring for others. And that has to be part of how we schedule our day, making sure we block out time for lunch, for breaks, for things like checking emails. Blocking off that time and seeing that as sacred is an important part of caring for the people that we work to care for, by caring for ourselves first. Integrity in professional practice. So we know that if, of course, reliability, honesty, impartiality, diligence, these are ethical values and principles. But research demonstrates that burnout leads to boundary violations and other professional violations. So finding the right balance in terms of our boundaries involves finding the right balance between self-care and care for others, finding a balance between personal and professional satisfaction. Again, confidentiality in terms of our values. Breaches of trust often occur when boundaries become blurred, and that can happen as a result of vicarious trauma, where our feelings and the feelings of others sometimes begin to blend together, or we stop being so attentive and we start noticing slips of the tongue where we say things, whether it's in a counseling setting, whether it is outside with family members or friends. And that lack of being able to filter, well, that's an extra bit of energy that is required, which if we are already on empty, we might not have the energy to be paying attention to those details. And that can really make a huge difference. And of course, competence in professional practice. So each of you who are joining live right now know the value of making sure that we continue to work on our own skills and improving and learning, connecting with other social workers. And that's hard to do when we're burnt out. And for those of us who maybe tried to make it to this meeting but couldn't, and are watching this later via video, all of those little things where this happened that led to that led to this, how do we advocate so that our schedule contains some pads, a little bit of padding, so that if there's an emergency that happens, we have the ability to address that? Because if we don't, considering especially that we are a profession that tends to be thrown into emergencies unexpectedly, that's when our own schedules can become unmanageable. And we know that when we are burnt out, competence tends to go first. So what should we do? I am not suggesting just, the scientific method of stress relief, bang head here. I am not suggesting that. first and most importantly, it's crucial to recognize the signs. Now, there are many different scales. I personally, for my research, have preferred the ProQoL, Professional Quality of Life Measurement. You can find it at PROQOL.org. There is a self-score, so you can just go to that website and click on the link, and you can assess yourself. Now, the reason why I like this particular measure is that it breaks up and measures the burnout in a way that also factors, that's a strength-based approach, which of course is a social work approach and also helps us find those strength blocks. Now, there are, of course, other assessment tools. We are actually working on one that hopefully by the end of this year, it'll look a little bit like your ethical decision-making tool that'll be help connect you to a variety of these different resources. So stay tuned. We are always working to try to improve the resources and services and ways that we can support you all. The University of Buffalo also has a wonderful set of assessment tools that you can look at. But I have found that simply assessing is part of an intervention. And in fact, many social workers do find that when you're doing an assessment, that is part of the intervention. When you become aware, I know, like when I did my own research working with different populations, people would be like, oh, you mean that's why I have this symptom? I thought it was just something wrong with me. Which, of course, the ways in which we negative self-talk instead of understanding that all of these different symptoms, difficulty concentrating, physical symptoms, difficulty sleeping, avoidance, jumping at loud noises, road rage, all of these things are actually reflective of the larger dynamic of stress. Now, many researchers suggest that it's actually a continuum. There are phases. I'm going to use this particular continuum phase. I'll talk about a few others because I find it really helpful. So it starts off with the zealot phase, then irritability, withdrawal, ultimately leading to the zombie phase. I probably don't even need to explain it because we probably have met zealots and zombies from Z to Z, but let me explain. And this is the piece that I think is super important because when we think of burnout, we don't usually think of this particular phase. The zealot phase speaks to those of us who are really keen on pleasing and super excited, and we take on more than we need to. We join every committee. We say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And we always want to go above and beyond. Sounds great. But why is it part of the continuum of burnout? Because eventually that honeymoon, joyful, it's going to be awesome, I can't wait to do everything, is not going to work because we're human. And as human, we have limitations. And so we're going to start, when we get closer to our limitations, we start to get irritable, we start to have a lower tolerance for frustration. We might be starting to have difficulty concentrating. We might be starting to have a few physical symptoms that can lead, if unchecked, to the withdrawal phase. So enthusiasm would sour, clients or patients might become a blur, we become forgetful, we stop doing laundry regularly or dishes or, all of those chores at home. We stop having fun, we might start having physical symptoms. And if we still let this go unchecked, the zombie phase, that's where we have this sort of lack of hope, lack of pleasure, lack of humor, start to have a distaste, judgment, contempt for others, a sense of numbness, illness, dissociation, addiction. This becomes a much more difficult situation to think of. So at any point along this continuum, two outcomes are possible depending on the intervention. Either the zombie phase can become a new permanent state of burnout, reinforced by destructive or addictive coping mechanisms, Or there is a recognition that the distress we feel is part of a much larger problem, one that we can't fix on our own, but one that is possible when we join together with others like ourselves to channel our anger and frustration to advocacy, working upstream to transform the pathological systems that have created our frustration and despair that comes from feeling compassion for its victims. When we can recognize this pattern and the ways it connects with our own personal stories of trauma, as well as those of our colleagues, coworkers, maybe even our clients, our bosses, then we stop personalizing things. And we know that the stories we tell ourselves can contribute to stress or lack thereof. So when, for example, we feel like someone is short with us, we may not know why they're being short with us or they have attitude. We can either personalize it, which is what happens too often when our own resilience is down because we're feeling burnt out, or we can say, oh, they're having a rough time, and recognize it as part of a larger system. So different researchers have come up with 5 phases, 12 phases. It all starts similarly with that working hard honeymoon phase. And that's the first thing. Whenever we start something new, it can be super tempting to be like, I'm going to do everything. But if we can recognize that that is actually part of the stages of burnout, then we might try to be gentle with ourselves and not overextend ourselves, try to work on prevention of burnout. If we start to notice the stress, if we just say, oh, I'll get over it, we don't. We have to think about what can we do to try to address it in terms of our micro level, that's our own individual level, the meso level, the organizational level. Maybe it involves rethinking some of our processes. Is there a better way to do it? Or on a macro level, and that can be advocacy on a deeper level. If we don't do that at a different point, we know that the deeper levels of burnout are in our future. And so it can be helpful to, and unfortunately, often it takes people who've experienced burnout at least once to start being like, okay, I never want to go back there. What am I going to do? But hopefully, by having these required trainings on burnout and compassion fatigue, or encouraging you to use self-care as a form of professional development, we as a profession can try to work towards giving ourselves space to process, and hopefully that can then help us in channeling our frustration towards advocacy. But the earlier the intervention, the better. So it's not a bad idea at the beginning of a meeting, at the beginning of a day, just to check your battery. How are you feeling? Where are you? And if you are feeling in the middle, what can you do to try to fill yourself up? And recognizing that, saying, you know, I am on empty. I need to do this behavioral activation of do one thing that fills me up, or I am struggling, so I'm going to try to have triage, or I'm going to ask someone to help me in a part of my life, and trying to figure out how to make that adjustment. It's always a good idea to at least treat ourselves as nicely as we treat our technology, like our cell phones. There are, of course, a variety of activities that can also help us in that. And some organizations have tried to build these into their work. So a shout out, for example, to Alice House. I had given a variation of this presentation a year ago with CASW, and they heard this presentation and they invited me to come and talk with their teams, and they developed some techniques and strategies and policies to try to address preventatively vicarious trauma. There are many ways that we can all be doing that, and it can be in terms of just even self-reflection questions, starting with a call to mission, like what is it, why am I doing this? Factoring in self-care. So many times when we think of burnout or we think of self-care, people talk about, I'm going to do exercise, or I'm going to do a bubble bath, or I'm going to get a pedicure or massage. And all of those are wonderful, but they are part of the physical realm of self-care. So if we look at the self-care wheel, we realize that we are human beings. We're not just bodies, and we have emotions. We've got a variety of different components, and it's important to think about how can we nurture ourselves on more than one level, in more than one way. Because if we're only doing it in one way, then there may be parts of our stress that are not being addressed. It is certainly most important to adjust our own expectations of ourselves. And we sometimes are surprised when we're burnt out. Oh my gosh, I can't believe what is wrong with me. And really, it's not a bad idea to be planning for it. This is why every social worker at the college is required to do some self-care, because the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering, loss, stress, trauma daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So there's certainly an important component of acceptance. Now, acceptance isn't saying this is good and I'm going to just let it be. But it is important to recognize that burnout, vicarious trauma is part of the work that we're doing inherently. It is part of it. It is part of the way the system is currently designed. And so part of acceptance is developing a plan to figure out how to address it. That in itself is super important, because if we're not accepting it, then what we're doing is we often personalize it, blame it, tell ourselves stories, and sometimes that can make it worse. Ironically, as Carl Rogers said, right, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. When we as a profession accept that this is part of the dynamic of the systems within which we work, then perhaps we can align ourselves, maybe even with the people whose associated stigma we are dealing with, and we can join together as a larger group. And this is part of what our annual advocacy day is all about. We can join together with others and recognize that the system needs to change. And that is an important part of how we can address the experiences of burnout. Advocacy is about changing what is into what should be. So first, we want to, of course, accept and recognize and identify, come up with some strategies to cope, but then that's still not enough. Like, there's no bubble baths in the world, not enough bubble baths in the world to deal with all of the trauma that is being put upon all of us as a result of the colonial, racist, unjust systems within which we work. And so we need a lot of energy to be working towards this activism and recognizing that advocacy shouldn't just be one thing, but recognizing that intersectionality, that we're all in this together, because that divide and conquer is part of what burns us out, because then we're alienated and we're unsuccessful in our efforts of overturning a system that is unjust. So there's short-term and long-term consequences to what I'm saying. The short term is, let's try to take care of ourselves. Let's not consider it selfish. Let's recognize that that in itself is an act of political resistance and resilience. Try to focus on what CBT would call behavioral activation, trying to do something positive for ourselves every day. And trying to focus on the positive, working on our narratives. And these are certainly lovely, lovely ideas. However, as social workers, What differentiates us from other helping professionals is recognition that none of the experiences that we have exist in isolation. They are there by design, and they are part of the system. And so we need to focus on that as well. But it's not a bad idea as part of that self-care to focus on our empathy. And what that means is maybe creating some rituals to help us switch between work and off work modes. So potentially it's your drive home, potentially it's exercise, maybe it's washing your hands at the end of meeting a client, maybe it is some type of way of truly developing a ritual, whether it is at the end of the day or before you go on vacation. How many times do we go on vacation and it takes us 3 days just to get into vacation mode? One of the techniques that research shows is helpful is creating rituals to make it conscious as you are switching from work to off work mode, and being intentional about having those off work modes, whether it is I'm not going to check this file of my email when I'm off, or whether it is turning something off. Being able to establish those boundaries are super important. But one other thing, so the ProQuil component, and the reason why I like ProQuil is, in addition to measuring one's compassion fatigue and burnout, it looks at one's compassion satisfaction. And research shows, and certainly my research has proven this as well, is that compassion satisfaction can offset compassion fatigue. So, for example, if one works in an emergency room, or one works in an ICU, or one works in rehab, there's different levels of stress, and the emergency room is considered the most stressful, in part because we never get to see people getting better. We sometimes see the same people over and over again. We see people at their worst. And so emergency rooms tend to have higher turnover. Other professions have an easier time. If you're working in rehab, for example, you get to see people getting better. And so those success stories become part of the sort of mental folder that we can turn to when we're stressed and be like, okay, this is hard, but look at what X, Y, and Z accomplished thanks to the work I did. This can be fostered. It can be fostered in a team. It can be fostered individually. What did I do today that I am grateful for? What gives me a sense of satisfaction? Research shows that for depression, a gratitude journal is effective. A compassion satisfaction journal is just a variation of that, but it can be helpful to focus on those things within one's work that gives us meaning and purpose, knowing that because of me, this person has electricity, because of me, this person has a house, whatever that is. Research shows that the more we strengthen that, even if all other vicarious trauma causes remain the same, our experience of burnout is diminished. So working on compassion satisfaction is a significant thing that each of us can do. That's true on a micro level. It's true on an organizational mezzo level, especially if someone who's here is in a leadership role, that we can be celebrating things that we've accomplished as a team. And as a larger level, what can we, on an advocacy political level, be celebrating, and what can we be doing on that front too? Mental note, let me take this opportunity to remind you about our social work awards that we will be giving as part of our annual gala, where we celebrate amazing social workers. If you have any social workers that you would like to be celebrating, having recognized, please do not hesitate to let us know. We have on our website and our newsletter, we're asking for nominations till the end of August. So if you know an amazing social worker or someone who's in an allied profession, so our social justice committee has one award for people who are not social workers, but advanced social work goals and values. Maybe it's a doctor that knows how to use social workers proactively instead of reactively calling us when it's too late and there's already a crisis. For example, someone who believes in a psychosocial, spiritual approach to medical care instead of just a biological medical pharmaceutical approach. Those are all wonderful people. We want to be trying to celebrate individually and collectively. The reason why is this comes from Viktor Frankl, who, if you don't know, he is a psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust. And when he was in the concentration camps, his way, in the extermination camps, his way of surviving was by trying to study who coped and who didn't cope. And his method of surviving was, I'm going to write a book about it. And he did. Man's Search for Meaning, amazing book by Viktor Frankl. And what he said is, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. And that is key to compassion satisfaction. When we have a why, when something happens and we can, instead of letting it blow us over and make us feel frustrated, we can say, this is what I'm doing this for. I am going to take my anger and frustration or feelings, and I'm going to channel it towards advocacy, sublimating it, alchemy. That's one of the strategies that can really help. So how do we increase compassion satisfaction? The first thing is, what is your why? What led you into social work? What is it that first got you started on this journey? Hold on to that. Have new reasons come up for you? Talk about them with your colleagues, with your friends, in the chat. Let's take this moment to share, what is our why? What is motivating us? And let that fuel us, because that compassion satisfaction can offset the burnout. And how do we do that on a systemic level, on an organizational level, on an individual level? When we see burnout, can we channel our anger and frustration toward advocacy and change? Could burnout become part of our why? Maybe it's our wake-up call. Maybe it is our wake-up call to work towards a system and a society where equal rights are an integral part of the design, not something that we try to like add and tack on with a sticky note onto a system that remains deeply colonial and problematic. And so that is the end of my presentation. I am going to now stop share, and I would love to take any questions. I love that people are starting to share some of their whys. Hi, Erin. Yes, thank you for inviting me back to Alice House. I appreciate that. And I'm here for you to talk with your teams, to do whatever I can to support you. This video is available soon. We have a YouTube channel. Did you know that we have a YouTube channel? We have a YouTube channel. So you can watch the YouTube channel and share this with others. I'm having difficulty seeing questions, but if anyone has any questions or comments, we actually have about 10 minutes. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments you might have. All right, so why don't we, I'm going to, I love this. We're all, this video will be available. I can make the slides available. Okay, a question. Would you use assessment tools with clients, and what is meant by neoliberal managerial practices? Two great questions. Rebecca just put our YouTube channel in the chat, so check it out. Would I use these assessment tools with clients? I would. I believe, I mean, it depends on every client, so it's important to make a good assessment. But I have increasingly, the longer I've been in social work, come to realize the therapeutic value of helping our clients understand that what they are experiencing depression, hopelessness, anxiety is part of the system, and that there is something deeply therapeutic in, number one, engaging them so that they can become an active participant in change. So that is A, system-wise, advocacy-wise more effective, and B, it helps us stop being passive, victim, experiencing it, feeling helpless. So being able to channel that is very important. So the more we can educate our clients to understand and see the deeper systemic issues, that's part of what makes us social workers, is recognizing the social components to our individual experiences. So I would absolutely do that in a different context. I have worked with a variety of different people who've experienced burnout and compassion fatigue, and when they have done the assessment tool and we've talked through just even that self-evaluation, it usually brings this big aha. I didn't realize that all of these symptoms I had was connected to my job. Once we realize that, that is already like half of the challenge. And really, that's a different clinical conversation. The better the assessment, the better the outcome. Now, the other question was, what is meant by neoliberal managerial practices? So, for example, one practice that is increasingly I've been hearing about many people having is their schedule is not theirs to make. So there are some people who are social workers or other employees who are they have like they're given, you have to see these 8 clients, and they're not given even enough time to drive between one visit and another. That is one example of a neoliberal managerial practice. I bet that many other people here have some examples. I see Jim Morton right here. He's part of our social justice committee and talks a lot about the ways in which some of these managerial practices, right? Like, we are the same social workers in any context, but we are more effective or less effective depending on how we are utilized. So if we are integrated into a healthcare team, and the healthcare team is recognizing the importance of psychosocial determinants of health, like, for example, whether you're living in a safe place, whether you have transportation to make it to your future appointments, then you're going to have a much better approach. But strategies that only call in the social worker when there's already a crisis and don't bring them in early, that is a practice that is focused on what seems to be a cost-effective way to utilize resources. I'm not going to bring in the social worker unless we need it. I'm not going to hire as many social workers. What actually is happening is it actually makes it more expensive, more difficult, have more complications, and people wind up having to potentially use more pills to try to cope, and that's where the pharmaceutical industry's push is. A lot of attendance management policies and procedures would fall into neoliberal management practices, absolutely. Not being able to take breaks. So these are all reasons why it's important for social workers to organize and advocate, whether it is within one's union or in other ways. Our social justice committee has been working on this issue very intensely because we recognize that it is an issue that's affecting us all. And there are larger systemic issues. These are, many of you know that I used to work in the States, and I recall when our one organization, mental health organization I worked with, said that we had to be doing our documentation while we were meeting with a client. So if I was meeting with someone who struggled with paranoia and schizophrenia, I had to be writing notes with them. And that was not necessarily very therapeutic, as opposed to having someone meet with someone and then working to do their documentation separately. They were trying to make it so cost saving that only things that are billed for, that we wouldn't do anything outside of what we were billed for. There was zero time that was allowed that was not billed for. Now, certainly there might be strategies to find a way to engage your client in a documentation process that nevertheless it is a challenge. Now, a question that was brought to me is how can frontline social workers function, or what should they do when managers who are also social workers are not keeping with social work values? That is a great question. And it is something that we are working with on many different levels, because oftentimes managers report to people higher up as well. We have developed new communities of practice for frontline social workers, as well as communities of practice for people who are in leadership roles as social workers, because we are thinking about other ways of strengthening the unique leadership role of social workers. It involves a culture change for the broader organization. So I think it's important for social workers sometimes to realize that that how much is system versus individual, and maybe finding ways to work with the college or with your unions to address some of the policies. It's a deeper conversation though, and luckily, mark your calendars now, October 29th, we are going to have hopefully a day-long conference on mental health, and we're going to be addressing some of these issues in that setting as well. So with that, I want to thank each of you for sharing all of your wonderful comments with one another. Let's see, my experience with compassion fatigue and burnout have been when my previous managers who are not social workers did not understand the role that a social worker has within an organization. That is 100% part of this. And so that's where, the college is here. Sometimes we come in to try to help provide some of that. Your unions are there. Maybe there's room for some more organizing and advocacy and educating. Talk to us. I would love to brainstorm other ideas. Maybe we can have a special what employers need to know about having a social worker. I could see that being a really cool professional development program. So if you're interested in helping me with organize that, it can be something we just organize. Maybe we record it, and then we can help send it out to some of the major employers. Yes, I am excited about anyone who's part of our many different committees. Thank you all so much. And please take care of yourself. We have, I see, 2 minutes. 2 minutes is still something. So why don't I give you the gift of 2 minutes to go take some time, take a deep breath, stretch, do something for yourself, maybe write something in your schedule and make a commitment to yourself to take care of yourself, because that is an important part of the work that you're doing. All right, thank you all.